You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have a cataclysmic update at the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court. Can you explain the ruling that they just handed down?
Yeah, Brian, the Supreme Court just rewarded the Trump administration for repeatedly violating court orders by deporting people to third countries without giving them the constitutionally required due process rights of notice and opportunity to be heard. The Supreme Court rewarded those violations of court orders by lifting a stay and telling the Trump administration, keep it up. Inexplicable, Brian, and they did it without authoring an opinion. The only opinion we have in the case is the dissent, authored by Justice Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson, laying out 19 pages of why this is a horrific and indeed lawless move by the majority of the Supreme Court. That, right-wing 6-justice majority that we see so often gallop in and help Donald Trump continue to abuse the power of the presidency. Completely inexplicable, and they don't bother explaining it. But here is, in essence, what happened. So people can be deported. People are deported every day after they've been criminally convicted. They are subject to deportation, and frankly, that's the way the system should work. However, even somebody who is deportable and has otherwise had their due process rights honored, they got to make their pitch with the assistance of counsel in court as to why they shouldn't be deported, and a judge ruled, no, I'm ordering you deported. That's fine, but that's not always the end of the story, and it is often not the end of the rights a particular person has, because the next issue that has to be broached is, where is the Trump administration going to try to deport this person to? And the rule is that people can be deported generally only to countries with which they have, quote, a meaningful connection. That's the law. However, this Supreme Court case has to do with what we call third country removals. Any country that will accept the person regardless of how dangerous the circumstances are in that country, and perhaps most importantly, regardless of whether the person may be subjected to torture if that person is deported to a country that he or she should not be deported to. So the Trump administration just started to sort of willy-nilly take people who were deportable and send them to third countries where they were at risk of being tortured. So what happened? Well, there was a suit filed, and it was filed by somebody whose initials we know, but whose full name we do not know, because they were trying to protect the plaintiff's identity. It's somebody that the court documents refer to as OCG. That's his initials. He's a gay man from Guatemala, and he had been tortured in Guatemala, so he should not have been deported back to Guatemala given the prevailing law. But of course, the Trump administration doesn't care about all that. So a suit was filed that it eventually became sort of a class action suit. And the trial court ordered the Trump administration not to engage in basically unconstitutional third country removals until they gave each and every person their constitutional right to be heard on whether they would risk torture if they were sent to a particular country. Look, this is just the court system trying to put in place an orderly process so everybody's due process rights can be honored. And what happened was the Trump administration multiple times violated the trial court's order. So what the judge did is the trial court judge issued a preliminary injunction saying, okay, you're done. You're done with these third country deportations, third country removals, until we can litigate this issue fully. So the trial court judge put a temporary pause to these particular kinds of deportations. And the First Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that preliminary injunction. So what happened? The Trump administration ran up to the Supreme Court and asked the court to lift the stay and allow what are unconstitutional third country removals to continue while this issue is being litigated through the courts. This seems to be a no-brainer, but in an unwritten opinion, the court said, yep, we're lifting the stay. go ahead and just continue doing what you were doing, endangering the lives of people, deport them to third countries where they may run the risk of being tortured, and we're not going to give them an opportunity to be heard and make their case as to why they shouldn't be deported to a particular country. And that inspired, as I just mentioned, a dissent by the 3 justices, and it was authored by Justice Sotomayor. Let me just read a little bit of what she said. She said, in matters of life and death, it's best to proceed with caution, but rather than allowing our lower court colleagues to manage this high-stakes litigation with the care and attention it plainly requires, this court now intervenes to grant the government, the Trump administration, emergency relief from an order it has repeatedly defied. I cannot join so gross an abuse of the court's equitable discretion. In other words, she makes clear throughout her 19-page dissent that what the majority of the Supreme Court just did was reward the Trump administration for violating court orders, not to mention violating people's due process rights. Again, they didn't tell us why, so this result is inexplicable, not to mention dangerous.
Glenn, is this just the Supreme Court lifting the stay, or is this them ruling on the merits? Is this eventually going to get back to the Supreme Court, or is this just one narrow ruling as it relates to the stay here?
Yeah, Brian, you're right. It just has to do with the stay. In other words, while this case is being litigated in the trial court, the sort of ins and outs of exactly what kind of due process rights somebody should enjoy when the Trump administration is trying to remove them to a third country with which they have absolutely no connection, that will continue to be litigated in the trial court through the appeals court and then back to the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, because they lifted this stay, they're saying, just go ahead and continue to violate the Constitution. Right. But this is something that is not yet resolved on the merits. Unfortunately, the damage will be ongoing.
Does this signal how they'll rule if and when this thing finally makes its way up to the Supreme Court so that the Supreme Court can rule on the merits? Like, it would strike me as bizarre if the Supreme Court would allow the Trump administration to keep doing this by lifting the stay, but then when it makes its way back around to the Supreme Court so that they can rule on the merits, that they say, no, this is not allowed. Because if it was not allowed, why wouldn't they have just left the stay in place in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great point. It signals how they will likely rule, but it certainly does not guarantee that they will rule in favor of the Trump administration once they get to the merits, because sort of this emergency relief, preliminary injunctions, temporary restraining orders are sort of an indication that, look, it looks like there's a really robust issue here, so we're just going to freeze everything rather than letting one party proceed with something that might be unconstitutional. So it's some indication of how the Supreme Court may ultimately resolve the issues, but it is by far a sure thing that the Supreme Court ultimately, when it gets to the merits of the litigation, will continue to allow the Trump administration to just sort of violate the Constitution.
So, Glenn, is this an instance where, because the Trump administration is doing it and the federal government generally gets a presumption of regularity, that the courts are going to kind of de facto just defer to the administration when they're deciding whether to lift the stays or keep them in place? And because the administration wants it to be lifted, they get that deference at least before the Supreme Court has had the opportunity to rule on the merits.
Yeah, that is some of what might be at play here, because the presumption of regularity, I think, is actually a useful rule of thumb. And what it stands for is the proposition that, listen, we're going to assume the federal government will continue to act lawfully and constitutionally. Now, I think that is folly in the age of Trump. And this is another instance where we're using old norms and traditions and the goodwill of men and women, when that has no place being applied.
Correct.
To the
Correct.
Trump
They're
administration.
they're gliding off of all that goodwill that was left to them by previous administrations that were acting in good faith. They're just decimating it in the meantime, but the courts aren't catching up to them. They're not recognizing that this is an administration that is perfectly content to defy the law, but they're still, again, skating by all that goodwill that was built up in centuries past.
Yeah, the judiciary is like a big old steamer ship, and they see the iceberg coming, but they are so slow to try to move the ship to avoid colliding with the iceberg that, they end up doing precisely that, and we all sink in the process. But there's the presumption of regularity, and I agree that's part of what is at play here. But there's something that sort of butts up against that and contradicts it. It's called the clean hands doctrine. And Justice Sotomayor mentions this in her 19-page dissent. And that stands for the proposition that if a party comes to a court seeking relief, like the Trump administration asking, oh, please, please lift this stay and let us continue, you have to come to the table, you have to come to the court with clean hands, because we will not reward you if you have shown yourself willing to violate court orders. You come with unclean hands, and we're not going to let you benefit. Unfortunately, as Justice Sotomayor points out, I guess the clean hands doctrine doesn't matter. The Trump administration can continue to defy court orders, violate the due process rights of individuals. They come to the table with dirty hands, but the majority wants to go ahead and reward them anyway, given, the presumption of regularity. Again, all of this, Brian, makes no damn sense.
Right. Well, look, this issue, I think, is going to work its way back up to the Supreme Court eventually, where they'll rule on the merits. Hopefully, we'll see a different decision, but it will take a little bit of time for us to get to that point. And when they do get to that point, we will, of course, bring it to everybody who's watching right now. So if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. It's the best way to support our work and the best way to support independent media more broadly. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.